text for the pamphlet we gave out during their show. Some artists referenced writings from other artists, writers, and critical thinkers. And today we are going to look at 3 reference texts presented by the artists who utilized them, and how or why they were working with it in their exhibitions, and of how this text can respond to crisis. So we will then, after that, open up this conversation with everyone, including ourselves and Stephan, to talk more about the topic of crisis in art. And if you would like to ask questions, please do so through Zoom. And so first of all, I'd like to introduce the 3 artists who exhibited at Riviera Parking who are here today: Olivia Mole, Angelo, and Jisoo Chung. And I'm going to introduce them with a small bio for each person. So Olivia Mole is an artist based in Los Angeles who works with installation, objects, drawing, video, animation, performance, and writing. She often reorients figures and materials from popular culture in order to disassemble the values of social and historical power hierarchies. Angelo is a Los Angeles-based artist who holds an MFA in photography and media from the California Institute of Arts, or CalArts. Angelo's work uses mapping, topography, and diagramming as methods of criticality towards American cultural and political power structures, constantly hinting at an end times enigma, which seems omnipresent in a contemporary environment plagued by disinformation and dissent. And Jisoo Chung is a Los Angeles Seoul-based media artist working through video and installation. Her work navigates female subjects constructed in daily based technologies. Born in Seoul, South Korea, Jisoo received her MFA from UCLA in the area of new genres and her BFA from Seoul National University in Art. She has shown her work both nationally and internationally. That's my introduction to everyone, and we will begin with Jisoo, right? Or Olivia.
Shall I go first?
Olivia. I'm waiting for power to come back on in my house, so we'll see how that goes.
Shall I go first? Can you hear me? I can't hear you, Alex.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I hear you.
Okay, go ahead, Jisoo.
Okay, I'll go first. And I can share my screen, right? But if I share,
is this your height? No.
Try again.
wait, sorry. How to sorry. I share this.
Jisoo?
You should be able to share your screen.
Right. Yes. And if I do I don't know how to press this in. PowerPoint.
So Jisoo, do you want to try and figure that out, and we'll start with Nick?
Sorry.
No worries.
Yeah, I'm trying to
All right,
Yeah,
so you want me to,
Yeah,
you guys
there's a
want me to go?
yeah, I have some issue of sharing the screen.
Okay. So should I just share my screen to put the painting up?
Yes, please.
You got it. 1 second here. Oh my God. I have to quit Zoom and come back
Yeah,
in.
that's my same problem.
I can share my screen.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Then
why don't we continue without images?
Mhm.
why don't one of you quit Zoom and the other one maybe? No, that does not make sense.
I'm just gonna quit really quickly and come back. Give me a second.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
Sorry, before you begin, Nick, Jisoo, do you also want to leave and come back?
and can I try sharing right now? I wonder if I can do that. I can do it, right? It works right now, right?
Right now
Okay.
we see Nick's screen.
Oh, really? Okay. I think I'm able to share the screen now.
Nick, do you want to pause your sharing for a moment?
Yeah.
That should be you, Jisoo, huh?
Yeah.
So yeah, so you can see my screen, right? But
Yeah.
and you can see the whole like the interface as well, or do you only see
Right
this?
now we can see the entire interface.
Oh, I see. Okay, so this is it's my mistake.
Now we-
Sorry. Yeah. I need to pull out the script in a different way because I didn't think the sharing screen will interact differently with the PowerPoint presentation view. But I can go ahead right away. Okay. Okay. I'm ready. So can I go? Shall I go?
Yeah.
Sorry for everyone to like make everyone late, and it's okay. Dictate is a book that was written in 1982 by a Korean American author and an artist, Teresa Hawking Cha. Through 9 chapters named after Greek muses, Cha hovers over historical and personal bodies of women that are moved and unspoken through force. Cha herself, Joan of Arc, the Korean freedom fighter Yu Guan-soon, and Cha's mother, who exiled to Manchuria as a refugee. Cha's family history of migration is rooted from a dark history of Korea, which includes Japanese occupation, Korean War, and series of dictatorship. For 31 years, a time that Teresa has lived, I lived in a place where everything changes so fast that even talking about a history and your family roots feels outdated. Until I moved to the United States, I never have thought about the experience of an immigrant. But why do I resonate with her text so much, especially in this moment? You are going somewhere. You are somewhere. This stillness. You cannot imagine how. Still, so still all around. Such stillness. It is endless. Spacious without the need for verification of space. Nothing moves. You are moving inside the stillness. Its slowness makes almost imperceptible the movement. Pauses hardly rest, new movement, ending only to extend into the next movement, stops as elongation into the next movement, into the new movement. 대사경차 dictate. According to Sarah Ahmad, if migration involved re-inhabiting the skin in a way that the different impression of a new landscape, which accumulate like points, creates new textures on the surface of the skin. And if migrant orientation is facing at least two directions, towards a home that has been lost and towards a place that is not yet home, the body of an immigrant is a doubled and fractured body, a crisis of a sense of wholeness as a body. For the body that is lost in between two directions, time is paused, the space is lost, and the movements remain still. During the pandemic, through the crisis of our bodies, re-inhabit our skins. The experience of being confined to the same domestic space every day instigates a sensitivity of a skin at a micro level. At the same time, a global pandemic, political turmoil, racial violence, and personally my immigration processes, these seemingly uncontrollable macro levels of forces also imprint our body. Thus, the body is fragmented by these macro and micro sensations, an extreme gap between touch and distance, creating a sense of displacement. For the production of the video, deliberate marking oblivious to itself, to sing very softly, I drew a map of Los Angeles across my chest and tracked the mark with the microscope camera. Tracking a mark on a body with a magnified perspective seemed as if I had a bad eyesight that I could hardly see, or groping a surface with my hand to find a path under the darkness. As the camera captures the close-up of an ink mark, but not the whole map, the footage is abstracted. It is hard to recognize what it is. This footage is projected to the night scene of Los Angeles. Wandering between this assemblage of micro and macro perspective of Los Angeles, I ask, how can my fragmented body coexist with this gap between micro and macro, inside and outside? In dictate, Cha's words and phrases deconstruct a conventional style of writing. Not even the mixture of three languages, Korean, English, and French, her intentional misspelling, miscapitalizing, spacing, and repetitions sometimes makes the text a riddle. These disruptions create suspicion of a literal meaning, almost acting as an incantation, meditation, a poem, a song. This constructive writing style can be not exactly plausible, but to be liberating. Quote, The immigrant's discomfort with English is made into a plausible form of expression. Quote, Kathy Park home, minor feelings. Suspensions, disruption, repetitions act as a breath between words, a breath that I can recite. The fracture of a language creates a room for others to occupy. Truth embraces with it all other abstentions other than itself. Outside time, outside space, parallels other durations, oblivious to the deliberate brilliance of its own time. Mortal, deliberate marking. Oblivious to itself, but to sing very softly. There's a Cha dictate. Singing is a form in which the body coincides its inside and outside. When vocalizing, you take in the outside air and take out your inside air. You vibrate your lungs and your throat as it becomes an amplifier. While the sound wave oscillates the air as well as your body, these moments of micro-vibration blurs the line between the body and the outside. In vocalization, the subjectivity is multiplexed. You are a singer, but also a listener in which the voice simultaneously echoes back into your ear. You hear your voice from outside as well as from inside when your body reverberates. With these micro moments of vibration, singing opens up the possibility of the body merging with the outside. Singing is also free from the weight of the words, the literal function of the words. The delivery does not fully depend on the literal definition of the lyrics, but more with the tune and rhythms. The body focuses on sound making rather than coherency making like speech. The body is content by the sound itself in the moment of singing. In my video, the footage of a microscope body and the landscape are accumulated upon each other, layering the frame within a frame. The outside frame becomes an inside, and the inside becomes again the frame of the outside. Projecting the footage of my body with the mark of a map onto the geographical landscape is an attempt to take out my body to the outside and to take in the outside into my inside. It is an attempt to reverberate the border between the body and the space, an attempt of a respiratory movement of singing. In the show Riviera Parking, a chronology of correspondence, the marks and the text guide the viewer through the empty space. These marks index the other side of a space, the time in the space, the time in the past, and the very action that was made then. The sound, the voices from the speakers, echoes in the space as if the room is a void body. The viewers occupy the space, the emptiness, and fill out each moment of the past with their own bodies. In a way, the deliberate marking is obvious to itself, but it is to sing with the others very softly.
Thank you, Jisoo.
This is it.
So next, Nick, you ready to roll?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming today. Okay, let me wait. First thing first. All right. Can you guys see my screen? Incredible. All right. So for my project, which was like a year ago today, I presented this painting and I wrote something about it in a pamphlet while I had COVID. So I'm not going to read that. Instead, I'm going to read something that I kind of a reflection on all of that. And it really, I was really into this Mark Fisher quote and more this like Mark Fisher his introduction to capitalist realism. So I chose a couple of quotes from that to reflect on and talk about a year later. So I'm going to start. And this is an excerpt from the first few pages of Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism. In one of the key scenes in Alfonso Cuarón's 2006 film Children of Men, Clive Owen's character, Theo, visits a friend at Battersea Power Station, which is now some combination of government building and private collection. Cultural treasures, Michelangelo's David, Picasso's Guernica, Pink Floyd's Inflatable Pig, are preserved in a building that is itself a refurbished heritage artifact. This is our only glimpse into the lives of the elite, holed up against the effects of a catastrophe which has caused mass sterility. No children have been born for a generation. Theo asked the question, how all this can matter if there will be no one to see it? The alibi can no longer be future generations, since there will be none. The response is nihilistic hedonism. I try not to think about it. There is no punctual moment of disaster. The world doesn't end with a bang. It winks out, unravels, gradually falls apart, which caused the catastrophe to occur. Who knows? Its cause lies long in the past, so absolutely detached from the present as to seem like the caprice of a malign being, a negative miracle, a malediction, which no penitence can ameliorate. This quote by Mark Fisher, the introduction to capitalist realism, stood out to me in its relevance of what it may foreshadow. If society were to crumble, who would even notice? Or would we even notice? And if anyone was to notice, what would noticing look like? Who would be there to document this winking out, and how? How do we respond to crisis if we don't know what is a crisis and what is not? Throughout 2020 and early 21, I made a series of paintings called the Funhouse Fantasy Fear Factory Fiction. I showed the final painting of the series at Riviera Parking 1 year ago this weekend. The entirety of each painting, I think, illustrates a structure in free fall, breaking apart and crumbling. I made the series in response to a time when confusion and anxiety were running rampant personally and globally. Under such circumstances, and with so much information constantly being delivered and regurgitated around current events, I developed a compulsion to figure things out, to put the pieces together. Naturally, this led me down the road of conspiracy theory. Not to a belief in any single one per se, but more so the idea of conspiracy theory in itself. I became obsessed. Why were the particular conspiracy theories present throughout culture today manifesting as they were? And why were some susceptible and vulnerable to such while others weren't? In other words, it was my way of making sense, or rather nonsense, of the tense relationship between sense and nonsense I was feeling on a daily basis. I didn't want to see what was going on as a doomsday crisis, because I'm going to get a little corny here. I do believe that humans are more resilient, adaptable, and compassionate than we give ourselves credit for, especially nowadays. Maybe confused and frustrated, but I don't like to think that anything is irreparable. Things may be hard, they may get worse before they get better, but I like to believe that we'll come out on the other side nonetheless. So I guess this project allowed me to deal with all of that. Pardon the wholesomeness. I wasn't sure if I wanted to put that in, but then I was like, you know what, I'm gonna talk from the heart here. So just a little disclaimer. The paintings are a series of rather obsessive diagrams drawing connections between entities that may or may not have any sort of real relationship. I found that aspect extremely important in a system outlined by fragmentation and a lack of identifiable power structures, at least from my perspective. Fisher would call it a system no longer governed by any transcendent law, but rather a system that dismantles all codes only to reinstall them on an ad hoc basis. Initially, each painting began with the entry point of Purdue Pharmaceuticals and the Sackler Empire, which is the only building that appears throughout the entire series. This was a decision made a couple months before the pandemic took course. The opioid epidemic for me represents a pinnacle symptom of a general emotional withdrawal made possible under given circumstances. Making this series felt like one of the most organic projects that I have ever endured. To entertain the question in mind, it didn't feel like a responsibility. However, it was entirely a compulsion. I had to know who, where, what, why, and how. Yes, I am a control freak, and yes, I am obsessive, which in this case served as a productive purpose, I think. So I'm not sure if artists have a responsibility to respond to crisis or choose to do so, but for me, it was neither. It was that I really couldn't imagine doing anything else.
Thank you, Nick.
This is, yeah.
Olivia.
Hi. So my power went out in my house about 15 minutes before this. And it has actually just come on, but the internet hasn't come up. So on my computer. So we can either wait 1 minute. God, this is the worst thing for everyone. Hi, everyone who's come to this. Thank you for your patience with the technology. And
Crisis over crisis.
We can wait.
if there might be a minute. Well, I'll describe what I was going to do, and we'll see if this slideshow comes up. The Wi-Fi comes up, but what I was planning to do, one of the texts that I had been reading was Jose Munoz's Cruising Utopia, and there it is, and it had actually I'd been reading it early in the pandemic, and I'd been combining. I had it on Audible, so it was sometimes I was reading it, and sometimes I was walking around the neighborhood that I live in, which is Glendale, and listening to it. So one of the things that what I'm going to do today, because one of the things that my show at Riviera Parking was about was about this kind of deferral of experience with these descriptions of experience and the kind of documentation and archiving of them, and a kind of separation and also kind of coming together that happens with that process. So I wanted to read this text from that was kind of key to this from Munoz, and it's basically it's Munoz describing Samuel Delaney's descriptions of two separate happenings from his autobiography. So what I'm going to do is, if you can just wait for 1 minute, I can get Alex's. I'm gonna hang up, and if you can bear with me, I'm gonna join from my computer, hopefully in like half a minute. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We also wanted to briefly explain to people in the future what a power outage is
Or why they happen.
or why they happen. I think in the
Oh.
context of,
Also mainly because I don't think people in Europe are really used to it. So I think it's a more common phenomenon in especially California, since all the power lines are above ground, and who knows what caused it, maybe a tree. But we're happy that your power is back, Olivia.
It is back, and I'm just obviously my computer had to restart, so I'm just getting all the stuff that I had. Okay. So for people who haven't seen the material of the show, what you're looking at here is images of that happened, the images that I took kind of almost randomly, just as I was walking around Glendale and Los Angeles in that period, and then interspersed with Polaroids that are taken by Ian Byers-Gamba of the performance that he and I did together in that was a sort of a collaboration between photographer and performer. So they're photos taken by Ian Byers-Gamba of what was happening in the space. Do you see the interface thing?
yeah, I can see the whole preview screen. Now it's in presentation mode.
Okay. So this is from Munoz. I begin this study of the future in the present by turning to the past. Samuel R. Delaney's memoir, The Motion of Light in Water, periodizes the advent of modernity through the evidence provided by two modes of avant-garde performance. These performances do more than represent an epistemic shift. They enable the memoirist to procure a new vista on the world. The writer describes images from his then present, now squarely in the past, and these pictures purchase a vision of the future. I want to suggest that these performances that are described by Delaney announced and enacted a new formation within the social. The first of these performances was held in a Second Avenue studio apartment in New York's East Village during the summer of 1960. Delaney and a cousin had stumbled on a performance of Alan Caprow's entitled 18 Happenings in 6 Parts. It was the first time the word happening had been used in a performance context. He remembers entering an apartment that was taken up by polyethylene walls on painted wood frames. These walls divided the performance space into 6 sections of about 8 feet by 8 feet. The sections were accessible from a door-wide space on the outside, but were separated from one another by semi-translucent walls through which one could make out the ghost of what was happening in the adjoining section. There were half a dozen or so wooden folding chairs in each room. The remembered performance that Delaney narrates consisted of a child's wind-up toy being set on the ground and let run and then wound up again and again over the 20-minute running time of the performance. Through the plastic walls, the sounds and sights of other happenings partially filtered into the writer's cubicle. He could make out the buttery glow of a candle in one room, while in another he heard the sounds of a drum. The writer's expectations were severely challenged by this performance. He had assumed that the work would be rich, Dionysian, and colourful. He expected the happenings themselves to be far more complex, dense, and probably verbally boundable. He expected happenings that would crowd in on one another and form an interconnected tapestry of occurrences and associations rich in meanings and meaning fragments, full of resonance and overlapping associations, playful, sentimental, and reassuring. Yet the work he encountered was spared, difficult, minimal, constituted largely by absence, isolation, even distraction. Delaney expected the 6 parts to be chronologically ordered, like acts in a play. but they were instead spatially organized. Delaney writes that it was precisely in this subversion of expectations about the proper aesthetic employment of time, space, presence, absence, wholeness, and fragmentation, as well as the general locality of what happens, that made Caprau's work signify. His happenings, clicking toys, burning candles, pounded drums, or whatever, were organized in the initial work very much like historical events. Delaney concludes in his recollection by claiming that 18 Happenings in 6 parts was about as characteristic a work as one might choose in which to experience the clash that begins our reading of the hugely arbitrary postmodern. That avant-garde performance is intimately linked to another mode of happening that occurs later in the memoir. Delaney was alerted to this particular performance venue by a painter friend in the East Village. His friend Simon had told him about the trucks parked by the river at the end of Christopher Street as a place to go at night for instant sex. Once the author passed the truck's threshold, he discovered that on a regular basis, between 35 and 150 men slipped through the trailers, some to watch, but most to participate in numberless silent sexual acts. Delaney describes these acts as rituals that reconstructed intimacy. At those times, within those van-walled alleys, now between the trucks, now in the back of the open loaders, cock passed from mouth to mouth to hand to ass to mouth without ever breaking contact with another flesh for more than seconds. Mouth, hand, ass passed over whatever you held out to them, sans interstice. When one cock left, finding a replacement, mouth, rectum, another cock, required moving the head, the hip, no hand, no more than an inch, 3 inches. The scene is described as engrossing, exhausting, reassuring, and very human. The writer explains how the men in this space took care of one another, not only by offering flesh, but by performing a care for the self that encompassed a vast care for others, a delicate and loving being for others.
Well, thank you all for your presentations. I think we would like to move on to the next part of this evening or this presentation and start talking about art in crisis and its relationship. And I would like to start our conversation maybe by asking you all the question if you felt like you had, if you had an urge inside of you to respond to this pandemic or crisis within your own art practice, or if there's any relationship within the work that maybe resulted since then in response to that.
And Nick, I know you already kind of said something about that a little bit, but yeah.
I mean, I'd be happy to continue. Yeah, I mean, again, I I don't see it as responsibility, and nor do I feel pretty firm about the fact that, like, you know, I think we were talking about this last week, that artists do not necessarily have a responsibility to respond to crisis. And I think it was something that Olivia said, like, when we were talking, you know, like a week ago. I agree that, you know, I mean, making, at least like putting the kind of like establishing like something concrete of like artists having a responsibility to respond to crisis would be like, I think, instrumentalizing art and something that allows for like so much more nuance and so much more just like room to kind of like do whatever, you know, within some parameters, like whatever we'd like and whatever we're kind of feeling and thinking and just like analyzing. And it's like, you know, for me, this kind of like deep dive into my soul, where I can like totally be the fantasy addict that like I am, and like the kind of anxious shit show that I am. You know, again, it was like very much like a compulsion for me, like going into constantly going into like this emergency mode, and like trying to put the puzzle pieces together of like something that may or may not actually be true. But again, it's like, it's really like the only space that I feel comfortable like actually being like exploring and producing with like the crazy fantasies that I have, you know. There's not really anywhere else in the world right now where I'm like okay doing that. So again, like it was very much like a compulsion, something that like I just had to do and like naturally kind of came to me, and like that I naturally continue to do. I can't really imagine doing anything else. So it's not very calculated for me, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, this was the thing that came up. I mean, we've kind of have been thinking about this question, and there was in this idea of responsibility. There's first of all, there's this kind of idea that art can be kind of effective in doing anything in response to crisis, other than like disseminating kind of graphs and public health information in legible ways, which is kind of design. But then an idea of responsibility in relation to all of these crises that were happening, both health crises and political and historical crises that were happening. And just thinking about kind of art making, like the responsibility. So for example, Nyx was spent a lot of the pandemic continuing to distribute clean needles, and in a needle exchange and that kind of support. And that is a responsibility in response to crisis, and acting on it. And whatever ways people partook in the kind of necessary actions that happened against state violence, against racism, against also kind of protecting ourselves from this disease. Those are all like the responsibilities. And then as artists, we're obviously working in that situation, and that's something that is kind of material, the sort of material that we're thinking about and working with. But I don't think there's like this idea that kind of art can save us or something, is not like I think it can in personal ways, and I think that there are conversations that come out of a way of knowledge formation and meaning making that doesn't have to kind of stick to the rules of rationality and sense, and can actually kind of undo things, and find different ways of articulating or disarticulating things. But it's different from this. Sometimes I think those things get conflated as like the responsibility as in a response to crisis, as that art can kind of do something to help the crisis. That is not. There are projects that can happen, which I think are kind of crucial to existence, certainly mine and people, my community, and but that it's also not it's a deferral of responsibility to think that kind of art is doing something, as well as I don't believe it can in that way. I think it's also an avoidance of the actual responsibilities that we have, and particularly in like times like the last couple of years.
Mhm. Yeah, it's funny that I actually got COVID and I um now like confined in my room, being isolated. Um, um, but yeah, um, yeah, I also do agree of um the thoughts about the responsibility, the arts is responsibility to responding to crisis, that I think we all talked about, like how that there is no like a fixed role, um, that like the art has to respond in like such a way to like a social in the society, but it was kind of coming out more naturally, um, because that's like at the moment, like that's what you can do but also cannot do. So I don't know what I'm saying. But I think in my work, I don't know how to change this. um, um, I like the style of the work, I think it changed really a lot, that like how I make work was also like a huge part of response to the crisis, I guess, because um I usually when I make work, I try to like think more conceptually or logically, or um like the all elements kind of like making sense to myself and then produce the work. But then at the time when all thing was happening, like all those things wasn't really like it wasn't matter. Like it felt like it didn't matter. Um because like the fact itself is not making sense in all sorts of aspects. So like then I was questioning that, like what do I do, what can we do at the very moment if you don't can make sense, like make um sense to like to explain the situation, or to like see the future, or understand like what's going on. It's just like really the fundamental acts, like activities that what we are like to make us like exist, like breathing, walking, and just like really basic micro actions that we're doing. So like the singing itself came into me in that way, that it's just um like thinking more focused on like the action of singing, the action of walking, the action of um like lighting, all those like small like verb actions, and what's the physicality that those action is holding, and try to like focus on more on that. I think that was the only thing that I could do, and I wanted to um, share those thoughts through the work, so that like the very physical um, resonation, the very physical activation um, of the action can be also like shared with other people, like more physically, like not as like um, literal or like a logical sense. Sorry, excuse me.
Well, I think since Stefan, who runs this space, poses this question through, or he posed this question throughout his projects that or exhibitions that took place here last year, maybe you would like to share some thoughts or have any questions?
Yeah, maybe I should ask you too. Just when you go back to the first beginning, when you decided to make Riviera Parking to open your garage and say, okay, we make the exhibition space there. Was it more like a kind of idea to open it because you will find a way how to present art, or was it also a kind of rethinking the structure of how art can reach a public space? Or this is, I mean, a garage is something between public space and private, and you open it, and it was a safe space. You could book time slots, and you could enter, and you be alone, and like it has different forms of space in one thing. And in America, the garage has a certain kind of history in developing things, more like than in Europe, maybe. So maybe you can tell a little bit how this project started and what your thoughts were then, and what's maybe, if this is what you're doing here is also a kind of artistic reflection about what the project is, maybe, and maybe there are some thoughts that came up because this exhibition is running since a few weeks.
Sure. So I think our primary idea behind doing these exhibitions was that we, due to the pandemic, had to move to a different city, basically, or we ended up moving to a different city. And we really felt isolated, like everyone else probably, or confined to our new surroundings. And we were using this garage as our own studio, basically, to make our work. And we felt like, since we had this space available to us and we were kind of missing more of this community aspect, or to like seeing people, basically, we quickly kind of started talking about how we could kind of create the possibility of people coming to visit us, or to incentivize them, maybe, since it's kind of still feels like a big drive sometimes if you maybe haven't done it before. So we decided that we would invite a lot of our friends, basically, and other artists that we knew, to come and do an exhibition. And then we just reached out to, for example, Nick, Jisoo, and Olivia, and we started to have these Zoom conversations because we were just missing to interact with people and to engage and to talk about art, especially. And I think through this, like, we in the end created this platform to be able to talk about art, since it felt semi-safe. It's a garage, you can open it. There was only a certain amount of people at a time there. But in the end, to us, these conversations we basically shared with these people had more weight than the actual exhibition, almost. That's, I think, why we also decided to create this webpage and to make this aspect also more visible, that to us it was always about this communal aspect and basically being able to talk and engage with people again.
And would you say this exhibition project is a form of understanding the situation you were now in? But I mean, for example, this was a place where you could open for art, but museums were closed. So if you compare art spaces and different form of art spaces and art space identity, then you have more kind of other possibilities if you make your own run space. And would you think that these I mean, there are different ways of looking at it. Maybe if you have this conversation with inviting people and in a special and bring them in a special situation, because it was the only possibility to show art. And you said that then you have these conversations with artists and afterwards maybe with people who entered the space. Would you say this is a form of how you for yourself dealt with this form of crisis? Or was it more like just that you wanted to find a way to keep on going what you did anyway? Or did it change some kind of perception?
I think it was definitely something that the pandemic caused. I mean, we wouldn't have done it otherwise.
We wouldn't have been in San Barbara if it wasn't for we wouldn't have been in Santa Barbara if it wasn't for the pandemic. And I think,
Normally you lived in LA,
yes,
but then you went
We
into
were
a house.
furloughed, or I was furloughed, so we had a hard time affording our apartment, and this house was available to us. So I don't know,
I
almost by
think it's
accident.
kind of also difficult to answer the question because, yes, of course, this is like what we were doing during a pandemic. And it's like that is a crisis. And in a way, yeah, we're responding to it. So there's no sort of yes, no, it's not so black and white. It was more just like something happened. We had to kind of continue on, but also at the same time, we're responding to it. So it wasn't like this, we felt like
There was no urge, and like it just happened naturally.
it happened more naturally, I think, than anything else. I mean, Niko and I have done a bunch of projects where we involve others and we work with other artists, and we had wanted to do that after I graduated from school. So I think it was almost like we knew that something would happen when we both had a bit more free time, and we did have free time and we had space. And
We were also curious how the pandemic was affecting people. So that's why we created this structure for these shows, to ask people, like, you have to show something that was created during the pandemic, and then we can talk about it. So we can also, throughout this process, see like what this new situation that we're all in is basically doing to us. Maybe not only as artists, but also as people in general.
Did many people from LA or from other big cities went into small towns or into suburbs? Like it was a kind of movement?
I think so.
I think most people that showed work at our space stayed in Los Angeles.
But in general,
In general,
people moved.
I think people who had the means to move to spaces were able to. But not everyone did. I think if you maybe were able to work remotely, you could go somewhere else. We were lucky to have access to a home in suburban Santa Barbara. I mean, the whole of Santa Barbara is basically a giant middle-class suburb. But I think if we didn't have that option, we probably also would have ended up staying in Los Angeles.
But and for you, you both you have the perspective of how art an art scene in Europe or here in Düsseldorf and in Europe also. You're exhibiting in Paris and Lyon, so you have a kind of overview about what's the discussion there, and some of the artists more deal with kind of actual situation, and some others don't. So when you compare your work and what you do and this what's going on here and what's going on in LA, do you see some differences in how artists deal with this form of crisis? I mean, when I talk about crisis, I don't mean a pandemic situation. This causes many other crises as well, and some issues, things we need to talk about. And do you think there's a kind of, do artists in LA or in the USA, do you think that they deal different with the situation, or would you say no, it's almost the same reaction of thinking about it?
I'm going to pass this to Niko because it seems like he really wants to answer, but I'd also be curious to hear what the artists who exhibited at our space would think, since I think all three of you have ties to other parts of the world. But I'm going to pass it to Niko first.
I just wanted to mention that I don't think there's like a difference in how artists here react maybe in comparison to people in America. I just think that the intensity of what happened next, not only with the pandemic, but everything else that was going on was, I think, more dense or more intense, as you could see also based on Olivia's slideshow with the Black Lives Matter protests happening while we're also in a pandemic, and then the elections and all these other events that were going on. I think people here don't really know or can't really imagine what that could have been like. I mean, maybe you can all also share your opinion or how you felt, but I thought it was pretty intense.
I'm happy to respond. I mean, again, like, I guess I just go back to like the, you know, the fact that like, yes, while I was making this work, like I was very much invested in like a response to crisis. But like, if I were to say that that was a responsibility, that would take away autonomy, I think, from artists in general. To say that like I have this responsibility, meaning others have a responsibility, that would mean that would just like pull into question like what art is for me entirely. And again, like for me, I mean, art is very much about like autonomy and being able to kind of like take our own reign. You know, at least in theory, for nobody else. Like obviously we know the baggage that can come with it, but it was really just something that was like a natural thing for me that was very much like a relief. I'm also the kind of person that, you know, just like oppositionally defiant. If you tell me something's a responsibility, I'm going to resent it. And like, yeah, I guess Olivia mentioned, you know, I do work with like, you know, with the homeless population, distributing clean needles. So that for me, like for more reason than one, I did see as like kind of responsibility, personally and on like a more civic level. But like art, you know, after doing that every day, I would go to my studio and have relief from that. Because I was able to be in the studio, you know, somewhere I was spending time alone and making this work. So, and it was just something that it was like something I had to do, but like not, you know, a compulsion, from like very, you know, different spaces, like very dark areas of my brain and very like bright areas of my brain, like kind of all the same. But again, I think to call it a responsibility would be very much like a disservice to like the organic process of like how projects and like how just like certain works come into fruition for us in the first place. You know, I think it kind of it can really remove like I don't want to say the beauty in it, because people make art for different reasons, but for me, it just removes the kind of just like rawness and like the tenderness and like the organics of it, if that makes sense.
I think I agree with what Niko said of how intense was in US. I think like of course I cannot compare like one-to-one because with other places, because I wasn't there at the moment. I was in the US. But I guess like by comparison, the easiest comparison might be like in Seoul in Korea and how the situation was there during COVID, was kind of like really contrasted to here, because it was like back then it was more controlled. The rates were way lower than the US, and it seemed more systemized and stable. And here, not even just the like the COVID itself, as Niko said, there was a lot of like social and political chaos that was happening, and just being inside. I think like everything was so new at the moment, that being out of school and being like the world suddenly changed, and like not even Black Lives Matter, the Atlanta shootings and like all of this like Asian hate crimes and everything was like very and like tangible crisis in all sorts of different aspects. So yeah. Olivia, you're mute.
Yeah, thanks. This question of autonomy is something that I always find a little bit kind of sticky, because I think that there is something in art making that kind of, like I was trying to describe before, that is a sort of an opportunity to think, to sort of think differently and discover and use the kind of different sort of different rationalities or different, like the different logic or non-logic of art as a way to think, as a way to kind of think differently. And I think that the excuse me, I think that the with this idea of autonomy, that art is this kind of separated space that is nothing to do with that, and I'm not saying that that's what you're describing, Nick, but art is this thing which is kind of can be removed from the world and everything else, is and kind of community and what's going on in it is I don't think is necessarily the case. Maybe it's just that that's not interesting to me, or like the art that sort of purports to do that isn't interesting to me. But also, I don't actually believe that art that purports to be completely autonomous ever actually is. I don't think that you can have a separation from kind of art making, even an art object, even when you look at it kind of materially as the kind of reflective surface of a painting that moves as you move in front of it. Is everything is always in relation, and you always come to something with in the context of a time and the space and the experience and what's happening that kind of leads you to be sort of having this experience of art in whatever form it is. And so, but I think that's a different thing from sort of, again, like this idea of sort of that art can be instrumentalized in order to kind of enact change. And I think that the question that was asked of that came up with Alex and Niko is a really good one of is that in like being in responding to something, are you responding to a crisis or a situation in that you're finding a way to kind of carry on business as usual despite those new circumstances, or are you actually kind of radically responding to something in not necessarily a way that's kind of instrumentalizing your art practice against XYZ, but in a way that is using art to rethink the things which have now sort of made themselves now it's kind of demanded attention, and all of these things are things that required that sort of needed our attention before, like police brutality, and like none of this is new stuff, but it all kind of demanded to be thought through, and I think that can happen with art making, but it's not to say that then the sort of art that the art will be then somehow kind of able or required of to sort of itself take down those things. But I do think it can be a different way of thinking, and I don't think it's as simple as kind of going, oh, there's like the kind of shitstorm that is happening in the world, and I'll deal with that in whatever way I can, kind of socially and actively, and then kind of go and do these things here. Which are separate. I don't think those are separate. There are ways of like existing in relation with these things, and they can be personal. Like it can be a personal sort of necessity
but it's not necessarily something which is, you know, like I think, what am I trying to say? I think that saying that art, it is not necessarily instrumentalizationable against these things is not to say that that art can't be used to kind of rethink everything.
And what would you, this is a question that goes first to you and then maybe to all the artists. I would say I have 3 more questions and then we open the rounds for the other participants in the Zoom meeting, if there are still some left. And we have some questions on to them. So you told me that the museums in LA, they were closed for one year, over 1 year. And here in Europe, we have a situation where different governments made different decisions. For example, in Germany, the museums were closed, but not for so long. In Belgium, the restaurants were closed, but the museums, they stayed open. And would you say this is a form how to close the museum? Do you think it was necessary? It was the right decision? Or do you think because everybody else is in the same situation and art is not an exception about this situation? And it's also, you have to treat it like a cinema and everything else? Or would you say it wasn't, in first place, maybe it was right, but not for 1 year. And there's some kind of problematic thing, because if you art has a certain way of responsibility in some way, and if it's not, you cannot enter it. I mean, we could enter your place, but not the whole more complex institutional structures. Then maybe there's a problem in it. What was your opinion about this?
Let me go first.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I think it was a shame that museums were closed for this long. I don't think it was necessary, since indoor shopping malls were operating and functioning, and it clearly showed that art for in certain countries for society doesn't have as much weight, I think. And in later moments of the pandemic, it was clearly without any problems functioning, and a lot of museum buildings, I think, have pretty good ventilation systems. So I don't think that it was necessary for them to be closed. And you can always, I think, create some kind of concept of running the space like that on 25% capacity or something like that. I don't know. So maybe
I don't know what the specifics were of the museum closures in Europe, but the primary concern seems to be to keep, if workers are at risk, I mean, especially before vaccine, if workers are at risk, then the museums shouldn't be open, because somebody's got to go and deal with that and put themselves at risk. I don't think that kind of the sort of the kind of whatever saving art can do, a museum can do, I don't think it's not something that is worth putting people's health at risk.
Well, Olivia, yeah, I think, and I completely agree. And I kind of just want to go back to what you were saying, with this question of autonomy. Because I think it's what we're talking about is at least in terms of artists making, is a very different story than it's not black and white. It's very much a gray area. It's a very complex question. And I kind of see it as some of walking a thin line, and having to constantly compromise and reflect and pull and decipher and process. But in terms of, I mean, in thinking about institutions and thinking about, not only this, but safety, personal safety, for everyone, collective safety. That was the big question that came up. And I think that that's completely separate, that that was really like an instance in which like we did have to think about things in terms of black and white, you know, at least from like a public health perspective. And I think, just a personal opinion, I mean, I think it was very, at least in America, public health, a question of like public health consciousness, like kind of like fell out the window, you know, and it became this kind of conversation around freedom, or individual autonomy. And like, you know, it was never really, it was all politicized, and it was really never really just like straight up public health, you know? So therefore, like, you know, yeah, like we still as artists, like we're able to, you know, we're still like responding and processing and doing all these things, but what we're talking about now is like is very different, because it's like this has to do with like with this has very much to do with like safety, you know, this and you know, I think here in this country it's just with the kind of way that many of us have been socialized, it, you know, a public health consciousness becomes very difficult. And thinking about like a collective consciousness becomes very difficult, because we're taught something completely the opposite. And I don't know. I mean, I obviously, like, you know, I think going to museums and like viewing art is like important for all of us and for culture. But when it comes to like people living or dying, I think there's a line that has to be drawn, you know, kind of no matter what. It's like more of like it's like, you know, a necropolitics kind of thing, like the question of like who lives and who dies. And, you know, that goes back on, there's so many historical and like, you know, colonial, post-colonial references that we can draw upon with that. And it's the same story over and over and over again. And I think the frustration, like for many of us, was the fact that this was just continuing. So, I mean, you know, therefore, like, does that mean institutions are going to be part of this, like this continued, like brutal lineage that is not stopping and only getting more and more confusing and fragmented and aggressive?
I'm also thinking of the like a really thin line to balance between like freedom of individual freedom and like the trust of institution, I'll say, or the trust that giving the institution to control me, to like affect me like as an individual, because yeah, like as Nick said, like the public health crisis, the conception of the public health was like really kind of confused by the freedom of speech in here, and the authority, like maybe it's more accurate to say like authority of institution. Because in Korea, the authority, like people like individual, the like, how do I say, the autonomy of individual is like socially, culturally more, I think, lower than America, and people are more used to like following the rules, like, and trust the authority of the institution. And because of that, it was more easier to control in like public health. So there's like kind of irony to it, that if you like put too much trust in the authority of the institution, it's gonna like be, the individuals are gonna just like depend upon what they choose to, like as Stephan said, of like the policies are different, of opening up the museum in Europe and America. It's, of course, it's important to like talk about that if that's necessary or not, but what's happening more in Riviera parking was like they like respond individually, like creatively what they could do in the circumstance. And there's like a value of like that individual freedom that they're being able to do so because of the pressure of the institution. But then like the other side, like we need to give some like authority to the institution to be able to collectively trust to something, to like in a safety realm, like in a safety issue. Yeah.
So what you
What do you
saying-
think, Stephan?
Well, this is what I do this project to find out. I don't have a clear opinion on this, but actually now, my question is more like, isn't it so important that it's maybe worth taking the risk, even for the people, not only for artists, but also people who are managing art or making their money by in institutions and all these things. I mean, for 1 year, it's a very long time. And after a couple of months, I think it was kind of clear how you could deal more safely with this thing. I mean, sure, there's a risk, but it depends on how you write art as an importance in this society structure. And if it has a high importance, you have to find ways to make it accessible. And I found it very interesting when you, as an artist, say, yeah, maybe it wasn't so much. Maybe art isn't as important for dealing with this state of emergency. And you know, this is a question I have for myself. You know, this is.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's completely tied up in the kind of socio-economic structures that are on the ground. So there's, for example, Alex and Niko can have a garage and have people into it and choose and kind of it's a thing that they're doing, that they can choose the safety that they create around that situation for themselves. They're not asking somebody else to do it. They're not even, so it comes back to labor within the institutions, is that yes, certainly if I kind of had a museum and was able to sort of bring somebody to come and look at art in it, then that would be great. But if I then have to also have other people, staff who are facilitating that, and those staff aren't choosing to do it, those staff aren't experiencing the art, first of all, they're experiencing cleaning the toilets and locking the doors. And the reason that they don't have a choice in it is because there isn't, certainly in this country and even in like wonderful Europe, there isn't, people still have to work in order to live and eat. And so that people don't actually have a choice to kind of participate in an experience of art when it's become part of a situation where wage labor is introduced to the situation, which removes experience from the situation. It's just about wage labor. And then it's a case of then you're not saying, okay, you have to make a sacrifice. You have to make you might want to make a sacrifice, or you could be encouraged to make a sacrifice or pressured to make a sacrifice in order that art can continue, when it's actually you're being asked to make a sacrifice in order that you can continue to live, buy food to live. And then other people who can dip in and out of that choice can then come and sort of have their takeaway delivered and then go and look at the sculpture. And that's so the problem is not necessarily whether art is worth it. So this is where you have like discussions like this, where the art, like none of the artworks that we made are gonna do anything to save the world, or like, but the continued conversation that can happen when people are thinking about this is something that is necessary, and in whatever way that's happening, it's like everyone, like I guarantee that there are people who are now realize that the police are not to be trusted way more than the general public were 3 years ago. Like I think you'd get sort of pretty like middle of the road political sort of people now acknowledging that the police are kind of dangerous in most contexts, and even like questioning the history of these things that come up when everything is thought about and considered. But I think that's a separate thing from sort of requiring of people that they put themselves at risk for something in order for other people to have an experience.
Yeah, but maybe it's not about having an experience. I mean, sorry, I'm just asking a little bit more directly. It's not my opinion maybe, but it's okay.
Sure.
The museum, they are built, and this whole structure and the jobs that are there, they are built around art and about what we as an artist produce. And they have a very high, in Europe, they have a very high safety, and they have, and all their jobs, they came from this art. And why not take then a certain kind of, I mean, you don't have to be forced, but if the malls are open and you have other people working there, and I mean, it's a question of relationship, and if you don't rate art as important for saving the world, then what is it? What's the importance in having art? You said the art piece will not save the world, but the experience of the people who think about it may, and then it's still the artwork who saves the world in some ways, and the experience is part of this artwork. I'm just curious about. I mean, you think more like in the social aspect. I don't want to harm anybody. But I mean, we put ourselves at risk as artists all the time, and maybe it's okay to ask the people who live from this art to get some risk. And by the way, I don't know how high the risk is. It's not. That's another point. If you have a big hall and there's 2 people and protecting the art, and I think maybe. The risk is calculable. You can live with this risk. So, it's not.
There's 2 people, but they've also traveled on a bus for an hour to get there, and all of the other that are around that. It's not that they kind of. It's just 2 people sort of existing in a massive hall.
And we don't. Oh, sorry, Olivia.
Karen, no, go for it, Nick.
And I think we don't necessarily, I don't think we really can like just assess the risk, saying that it's just 2 people. Yeah, just because like based on what Olivia says and like what Olivia just said. And, I mean, yes, like art is extremely important. Like I agree with all of that so wholeheartedly. And like in so many ways, like just what you were saying, Stephan. But if somebody dies for somebody else's experience to like view a sculpture, which theoretically is a possibility. I'm not saying it's happened, but I'm saying like we don't know, but we know it's possible. Then I mean, I think I it goes back to this like this question about like who lives and who dies. And yes, like I do not think that somebody's life is worth. Someone losing their life is anywhere near worth like my art viewing. To the brim.
And I think like the art itself, like the what I feel is the how do I say, like the very perspective of seeing art. I think a lot of times it's rooted from like the art history of like avant-garde art history and the aura that the art is like holding, and that's like rooted from like the history of colonialism, like colonialism and art, that like how art can like be like creating a new, like change like the whole what is it, hegemony, and that this like pioneership of art is like I view as more a kind of a like a spiritual of like colonialism, that like it has to be a kind of leading element that is basically rooted from like all the social and social like capitals and like the economic capital that was especially like centered in like European or like in Western society. So I think I view art in a more a perspective of just like being in an ordinary thing, like one of the ordinary action, ordinary activity that like can be connected in a lot of like different ways. In this, yeah.
But isn't it like to say you write a book with radical thoughts and then you're not going to publish it because you're afraid that if these radical thoughts change and make a movement and maybe somebody will die from it, or not going to a demonstration for your ideas because you think maybe somebody will harm somebody, and you know, like, isn't it the same attitude?
No, I don't think it's the same attitude at all, because I think it's like there's a different type of access there. In terms of like, you know, access to a protest, it's and access to a book about radical thought, it's more mainstream. The way that people like generally here access books about radical thought is through, you know, higher education. And, you know, the chances are I'm going to know about a protest and at least like know a little bit about what it's about, without having to do like the research and go through like the educational endeavor that me accessing or knowing like who an author is, why it's relevant, you know, its context, and even understanding the vocabulary, it's just going to be a different story. So, I mean, you know, I don't want to use the words here like armchair Marxist, but I think like what happens a lot of the time with artists is that like we very much get caught in these circles in which like we're all, you know, talking about a reading or a set of readings and like, you know, processing these like, you know, this radical political thought, but like, you know, I can't speak for everyone, but what I've seen is like that's all we're doing a lot of the time, and then we go home, or then we go to our studios, or then we go get lunch or with somebody, or whatever, but there's no action attached to the thinking. And I'm not saying that just that happens in general, and I'm saying it's very possible for there to be action attached to it, but I think it's important to consider, you know, the fact that like if we're going to really engage in all of this, then like and really like confront these questions, then and really believe in these questions and advertise our belief in these questions, then maybe we have a somewhat of a responsibility to to act accordingly. And I mean, it's almost like, you know, then do we all become social workers? I know I'm contradicting myself a little bit, but you know, it's just it goes back to this question to me of accessibility, and like, you know, and if I have the privilege and to access the museum and contextualize what I'm seeing in the museum and have it be this, like, you know, this place where like I go see a show and like that radically changes the way I think. If someone has to make a sacrifice for me doing that, then like that's just not equitable and it's not fair. And again, it's like kind of a bottom line for me. You know, especially if we're considering like the socioeconomic structures and going back to labor. If the museum's open, yes, like the curator has to be there, or, you know, people to give walkthroughs have to be there, but there also has to be somebody who's cleaning the bathrooms. There also has to be somebody who is, you know, selling coffee. And we all know that these are all, most of the time, like these are all jobs that that do put people, number one, put people more at risk, but number two, like, you know, are taken by people who just haven't been awarded the same accessibility that like most of us have on here, I'm assuming.
Okay, maybe this is a point where we can open the discussion to the few members if they like on the Zoom meeting. But I just would like to heavily disagree, but I'm not arguing about it. But what I would like to ask you as a last question in this discussion before we open it, would you say that this situation now we experience changed art in a way that it will last in, and we are entering a new period of artistic practice and a new epoch somehow, and or did you think it's just an extreme situation of the same problems we already have been, and it will not change art in general?
Hi. So to answer that question shortly, I think that we're living through a like history in a way. It like really strongly, I think this is a life-changing event. And then I think that this will affect all facets of life, including if you are an artist making art. So yes, in a way, yes. But it changes everything else. It changes how you interact with people. It changes how you associate with people. It changes how you maybe feel safe in the world. I know for myself, very personally, I feel a lot more anxious around groups of people. To fly to Germany was like the biggest mindfuck of my life. To sit on a plane with a bunch of people I didn't know, and I had never had that experience in my entire life. So art, I guess, yes, will be changed.
I have a question also, to question an assumption that's being made in this conversation, which is that the museum is the only place that art can be experienced. And the history of the museum is not really to do with art, it's to do, and the history of a certain type of institutionalized art objects doesn't really has as much to do with power and value as it does to do with art objects and them being experienced as a kind of community, a communal experience. And so if museums are closed, it just means that a certain type of art is closed. And I could, like, you know, there's a lot, Jisoo was already sort of touching on it, but like the history of a musician, of a museum, and of like the display of objects has its history in kind of royal collections, and a politicization of, and that very specifically talking about instrumentalization of art objects that were that were placed and exhibited in order to make a display of power. And then that was in the history of museums, and then that shifted on to making then the emphasis of what was being displayed became on this idea of art history and the categorization of things. And that was sort of when art history was sort of invented in order to have a different kind of ordering within these displays, but they were still ultimately displays from, I think, what were they called, the Kingly collection, or the Kingly collection, or the Kingly display or something. So there's also this sort of, this question that, and then nobody, I'm sure, here needs a lecture on what the museum still does for the value of collectors and of people whose works are in the museum. Like, we all know that anyone who is putting somebody who's has a lot of money, invests in painting because it's a certain part of the market, the more that those objects generate more money if they're given more social, cultural value. A way to give them extra cultural value is to have them exist in a museum. Like, this isn't a new sort of, like, the art object, the museum art object as commodity, and the museum as effectively kind of money laundering, that's not like news to anyone here, I don't think. I think that yes, there was art making that would continue to happen during the pandemic, but that's not to say that it had to happen in a museum, because the functionality of a museum is not just for art.
Yeah, and what would you say to my last question? Do you think that we are starting in a new period of artistic practice and reality, or do you think we just continue the way we practice art for in general?
I don't know if I really know yet. I agree with what Alex said, that, this is a life-changing experience in so many ways, but I don't know if I personally have like really metabolized the past few years enough to really have any idea whether or not it's going to change the way that we make or do or any of that kind of thing.
I think I see a lot of my artist friends change their method of art making. Like, a lot of, like, some people start like making paintings or small objects because it's more easier to make in your home, and they got into like that process and just like change their whole method around that. Or for me, as I said, like less conceptual, or practice was more developed. But I don't, as Nick said, I don't know if I'm gonna continue. I think it's really like depending on each cases, obviously, but but then I still go back to the theme that what I was interested in before, and kind of like dialectically like merge together. But I think there is a sense of idea that like less depending on this institution, based on like what Olivia said, and like thinking about the Riviera parking itself, that like trying less of being part of the institution, or like the being like instrumentalized. I think it's more like the practice itself becomes more an issue than like how it is instrumentalized like as an art. I think that can be a change that I can expect from myself and I think other people. But this is also like all assumption.
And I guess I'm interested to see like what that will look like. And I guess like just a little more in depth, I just don't really know if I like understand what that looks like yet. I mean, obviously, like we know about like, dare I say, NFTs and all that kind of stuff, but you know, and like maybe VR and like all these other digital kind of like aspects of viewing art. I don't really know how much that has to do with the pandemic, but I don't think, you know, these type of Zoom of like online talks are going away anytime soon. And the one thing I guess I will say is I think like, you know, art viewing from the confines of, I don't know if like practice, I don't know if I can really say that like practice has changed, but I think viewing has absolutely changed. The way that people view art in many ways, like, and I think, you know, I'm not saying this is for the better, but I think in terms of like, this probably isn't a rabbit hole I should go down, but like, I can't see this. I definitely kind of unfortunately see, you know, the era of the market kind of like continuing to explode in terms of like, especially it just completely, you know, synchronizes with the new way of viewing art from the confines of our home. You know, you can just, collectors can view fairs at home and click on what they want to buy, you know, with like Bitcoin or whatever now. So it's, so I think, I definitely think like, it, you know, the art market was obviously already been accelerating, but I think this was like another kind of synchronizing aspect of it being able to accelerate in kind of like unexpected ways.
Okay, maybe we now can open up the discussion to the other members joining us on the Zoom link if they like. Please then unmute your Zoom, and then you can ask questions to the participants. Okay. Otherwise, I would say, would you like to add something? Like what is already said? I mean, also thinking about what this exhibition is about and how you made, how the structures you made art accessible. I mean, this also that this access comes to artists, to these artists, to the artworks of these artists came through QR codes, who also were established due to this pandemic, you know, and because before this it already existed, but nobody was using it, and now you have to show this machine readable, only machine readable signs to enter real social spaces like a restaurant, and whether do I understand what is, and you know, how do you think that's, you know, this is one, we are talking about different layers. We're talking about, for one thing, we talk about the artworks, then we're talking about your project that I would consider as an artwork as well, and then we're talking about the artworks here that are about the artworks that to present, but all this layering is not, it creates something different and put your ideas in another context. Do you think you are able to reflect it already, or would you like to wait to say something about it until this exhibition finished?
I think maybe that's how we were affected by the pandemic, how the viewing changed. I mean, like Nick also mentioned earlier, like the QR codes definitely are a strange thing that we are so connected to now. Like they really became such a big part of our life. So we did grapple with using them also to show art, since you can't really change their aesthetic and they are just almost like a TV screen that you can utilize to show art, but then it's really hard for these QR codes to be art in itself.
And also the art or the documentation that the QR code displays is documentation of an exhibition. It's not actually like a virtual reality experience where you have some kind of a physical interaction with an object in space. So you're just looking at your phone to see this thing that we've designed on this page. So in a way, it is, I think, like disconnected. And I also have, like Niko said, have had a really hard time accepting the QR code in this exhibition. It feels somehow really wrong to me. And that's why I wanted to use it, because it felt really difficult to use. And I do agree about the levels, and there's levels of responses, but I think that this is something that I am interested in using in the future, maybe not in my own work, but in the collaborative work that Niko and that we often do together, because I think there's some potential in it. And also I want to say that I don't think in America, QR codes are as used as much as they are in Europe. I know that there are vaccine passes available, but when I was in California the last time, I couldn't download my vaccine pass onto my phone, which is a QR code. I could only take a screenshot of it. But here, when you go into any space, you have this QR code on your phone, and it's scanned by everyone unless you're in a grocery store. They control you on the train. You have to show them the QR code to get information, to get a COVID test. You scan the QR code and then it uploads onto your, this web page loads onto your phone. But the other thing, we just had a visitor in the space, and we were also talking about QR codes, and I was saying that, or she was saying that before Apple phones were able to sort of pick up the QR code, you had to download some sort of app, and that maybe would require Wi-Fi or data. And even when you come here to the space, there was someone who didn't have internet connection, and she couldn't use her phone. She didn't have data on her phone. She couldn't connect to this exhibition, which was also like, it in a way, these things are accessible, but they also block information. It's only going to one sort of specific thing. So it is very different than, say, viewing Haley and Sada's sculptures that they had in our space, or seeing Nick's painting. So yeah, I think they're interesting and difficult, and I'm not very comfortable in a digital realm. So I don't know how I quite feel about QR codes, but that's QR codes.
Okay. Then,
Okay, wait. I want to thank Jisoo, Nick, and Olivia for waking up early on a Sunday morning. I know you were all incredibly busy, productive people with a power outage, and you're all hustling in America, which is, I think, a lot more difficult than living in Europe. And it's been interesting to see the responses of you, of your thoughts on COVID and this project and your work in crisis. So thank you so much for participating. Do you have anything to add, Niko? And we're all really, you know, we're really happy. Maybe this shouldn't be on a talk, but I'm going to say it. We're really happy that you agreed to participate in your shows at Riviera Parking. I mean, Nick said it was a year ago. It's like, it's crazy to imagine that that was a year ago. It feels like 5 years ago or something like that. When you said that, I just kind of went there for a while. So thank you very much for giving your work and your time. We're very, very happy. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you guys
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
for everything.
Yeah.
All right, so can go back.
And thanks for Stephan for asking these questions, which is
Yes,
Right.
thank you
It
so
was
much
fun.
for asking these questions.
Thanks everybody who was
And
joining
thank
us.
for the audience. Thanks, Sean.
Yeah, thanks for the audience. And also this exhibition will be here until the end of February. You can come here in person and we will take care of your personal safety. And
Wear masks when other people are in the space.
yeah, and we are all tested today, so
Yes.
we are very safe
I
here.
have 3 vaccines.
And
I have to. Oh,
yeah, just add something, Olivia.
I was just going to say, just as a rather trivial thing, I went to Berlin for the first time about 3 years ago, and I arrived on a train. I was with my son. We got a train from Amsterdam into Berlin, and as literally the train was pulling into the train station in Berlin, there was a man on the platform with his kids and a bicycle, and he was literally wearing lederhosen to go on some like day trip. And he was like wearing them in like he was going hiking or something in lederhosen, and I was like, oh, this is the most German thing that I've ever seen, until seeing the window of you 3 completely in black in this cold room.
Missing his cigarettes.
Yeah. It trumped the lederhosen as the German archetype.
Yeah, this is how the pandemic creates a new German stereotypes. And we will think about this on another work. But so I would thank everybody who was joining it and was listening to it. You can come here in the studio. You can also watch this talk online. And I hope you keep thinking about this idea of responsibility of art in a certain way and dealing with it. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening or good morning.